The ambulance sirens sliced through the early morning, and I ran after it, my heart shattered. Inside was my husband, the famous pastor, the man admired by hundreds of faithful, writhing in pain, begging God for help. But only I knew the truth. This wasn't just a health problem. It was the result of a secret I carried alone. A secret that could destroy not only his body, but also the perfect image he maintained before everyone. And I ask you, how far would you go to avenge a betrayal? How much could you bear to carry the guilt of watching the person who hurt you the most pay, right there before your eyes, with no escape or hiding place? He was the pastor who preached holiness, but that night he fell into the abyss of his own hypocrisy. I watched the scene, motionless, as doctors rushed around, nurses whispered, and a shadow of shame spread through every corridor. But there was something no one knew. Not the doctors, not the church, not him. A silent detail hidden in my mind that changed everything. The secret that turned that night into revenge. I was sitting in the front row of Sunday service, as always, with my hands crossed in my lap and a smile that I had learned to hold for hours. The stage lights bathed the pulpit in a golden glow that seemed designed for angels, and my husband, Pastor Michael Thornton, was talking about purity, family, and the need to guard our hearts from temptation. The congregation murmured amen like an obedient tide. I watched his theatrical gestures, his right hand raised, the Bible open in his left, and recognized with a bitter pang the man I no longer knew where the pastor began and the husband ended. "It is in secret that fidelity is measured," he proclaimed, his voice modulated, perfect, as if he had rehearsed every syllable in front of the mirror. Not in applause, but in silence. The church erupted in applause. I clapped too and felt my own hands burning, perhaps from irony, perhaps from anger. My faith wasn't a performance, but his, at times, seemed like an expensive spectacle, with LED screens, a tuned band, a minimalist set, and a carefully rehearsed script. It's strange to feel like a widow to a man who is still alive. That's how I felt, a widow of empty gestures. At home, Michael was a clock that was never late for pastoral visits, and always had an excuse when he arrived late. The strange hours became routine, the flimsy excuses habit, and my intuition, a wound healing on the surface, festering underneath. The first time I saw a suspicious message, I thought it was a joke. The second time, I felt a chill crawl down my back. The third time, I already knew, and certainty is a blade. It cuts silently. In the church parking lot, after the service, he was still approached by 3 families asking for prayer. I remained a step behind, smiling, holding my purse and the sharp perception that, inside that pastor's skin, was a man who was hiding too much from me. "You are a blessing, Pastor," said a lady, shaking his hand. He smiled, that white, impeccable, picture-perfect smile. He placed his other hand on her shoulder in a paternal gesture and promised to call on Tuesday. I knew that on Tuesday he wouldn't call. He would be counseling someone or resolving a ministry emergency. The word ministry, in our house, already meant everything and nothing. The wild card that justified absences, forgetfulness, and the smell of strange soap on his collar. That afternoon, back in our quiet suburban neighborhood, I opened the kitchen window and let the fresh autumn air in. The neighbor's lawn was freshly cut. The distant sound of a basketball bouncing on the sidewalk brought me a sudden nostalgia for a simpler life. When marrying a pastor would mean walking hand in hand after the service, not protecting myself from the glare of others. I had memorized every routine of Michael's. I knew the drawer where he kept his blood pressure medication, the glove compartment where he left mint gum for long counseling sessions, and the almost neurotic care he took with his image. All of this was a map and compass for a journey I hadn't chosen, but that I was now leading. The messages started softly, almost innocently. "Pastor, can I talk to you about something?" "Private?" Then they became more direct. "I missed you today." I couldn't remember the last time missing was something that united us. I had tried to confront him 2 or 3 times. He cried. Michael cried well with the sincerity of the blue eyes that were a sanctuary for the faithful, and swore that I was misinterpreting, that they were traps of the devil, that times were bad and he was human. The last word, said in a whisper, was always the same. Human. And I then, what was I? The human's wife? The living widow? I could have exposed him. I could have gone to the committee of elders, shown conversation screenshots, presented schedules, and cross-referenced routes. I could have sat with the board and said, "This pulpit is rotten." But I learned that the truth, in the right hands, becomes a weapon. And in the wrong hands, it becomes a scandal. And scandal isn't justice, it's just noise. I didn't want noise. I wanted him to feel inside. Something close to what made my stomach burn and my hands tremble when I saw his photo with captions about non-negotiable holiness. It was at this point that the idea visited me, not like a lightning bolt, but like water seeping into cracks. He took every morning his routine medication on the wooden countertop, next to the fruit bowl. I saw the box, the numbered pills, the discipline of a man who knew how to dose everything: words, tears, presence. I wondered what it would be like if for one day the dose escaped control. It wasn't a pretty idea, nor was it noble. It was human, and I suddenly felt authorized to claim my share of humanity. That night, we went up to the bedroom, and before sleeping, he said that the next morning he would have a meeting with the youth leaders. I heard the script. Each line fit into the database I had accumulated of his disguises. "Do you want me to make your coffee?" I asked gently. He smiled and kissed my forehead. "You are my daily miracle, Grace." I swallowed the word miracle like swallowing a pit. My problem, not his. I lay down but didn't sleep. I kept listening to the noise of the cars passing outside, the streetlights cutting faint stripes on the ceiling. It was as if, in that house, everything had learned to behave. The doors didn't slam, the curtains didn't wrinkle, the sidewalk didn't accumulate leaves. Everything in order on the outside. On the inside, I was a closet full of stacked things, about to collapse when the hinge gave way. And it would give way. It was giving way at that very moment, a part of me that no longer wanted to be just the guardian of appearances. In the morning, the smell of strong coffee and toasted bread filled the kitchen. Michael came down wearing a light blue dress shirt and gray pants, his tie resting on the chair waiting for him. The expensive watch gleaming, a gift from a businessman connected to the church. He hugged me from behind, a hug from a perfect domestic scene. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Enough," I smiled. He swallowed the pills. I watched with a corner of my eye, without any dramatic gesture, without ceremony. The sky outside was clear, an almost dry blue, and the birds seemed to sing too loudly for a morning that had airs of silent confession. It was at that moment that a part of me wanted to scream. I could have said, "Stop, sit down, look me in the eyes." I could have pulled the right thread and made the whole sweater unravel. I didn't. Instead, I served more coffee. He commented on a charity event next Saturday, on the new armchairs in the auditorium, on the young man who wanted to go to seminary and needed direction. The word direction collided in my temple like a pebble. Who gave us direction? What guided us, after all? When the cup hit the saucer, the sharp sound broke the silence around us. He checked his cell phone. A message lit up the screen. His chin contracted for a second before recomposing himself. Everything about him was rehearsal. "I need to go a little earlier, honey," he said, already stuffing his tie into his collar. Pastoral situation." The pause after the word was enough for me to understand the subtext. I said, "Of course." And the "of course" came out so polished that it could have been a glass. He left confidently, with the steps of someone who dominates their own narrative. The electric gate opened and closed, and the world was quiet again. The emptiness of the house throbbed, a type of silence that forces us to listen to the inner noise. I washed the cups, put away the butter, cleaned the counter twice, unnecessarily, just to occupy my hands. The morning light hit the cutlery, pulling out small metallic glints that distracted me like fireflies. It wasn't just revenge. It was the desire to see the plot reversing. A small course correction, as if the universe needed a push to admit that appearances don't sustain the gravity of reality. I didn't imagine serious consequences, just an embarrassment. The type of irony that God might keep in his pocket to remind us that no one, not even the most acclaimed pastor, is above matter, body, ridicule. The doorbell rang at 9:10. A sister from the church brought apple muffins for the pastoral couple. I smiled, thanked her, promised to return the platter. When I closed the door, I rested my forehead on the wood for a second and felt a dense shiver run down my neck. Not from fear, but from something akin to premonition. A feeling that by pushing one domino, I hadn't calculated all the others that would fall. Before we continue, dear listener, allow me a moment. If this story has already grabbed you by the chest, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts. Every day we bring narratives that poke at what is most human in us: desire, guilt, forgiveness, and what hides behind the curtains of our best version. Leave your comment with your impressions. Your reading changes the way I tell the next scene. That late morning, I took the car and went to the market. I needed milk, fruit, and above all, the mechanical comfort of choosing oranges and observing people with their lists and carts. The grain aisle seemed like a confessional where no one would need to lie. Back, I parked, opened the garage door, and for the first time in a long time, I wanted to throw away half of what we owned. The accumulated things seemed to me silent witnesses of a domestic farce. The photo albums displaying our frozen joy, the church awards for exemplary service, the laminated thank you letters framed in Michael's office. At noon, I received a message. "Everything okay there?" It was from his assistant, Lucy, always cordial, always correct. I replied, "Yes, thank you." She came back. "The pastor mentioned that he may be late today. Complicated schedule." I stared at the screen for a while, as if there was a secret written there in invisible ink. "Okay," I typed. And only then did something build inside me a kind of dangerous calm. A calm that anticipates the fall, like the quiet of the forest before the storm. At 2 p.m, the landline rang. The landline rarely rings. I looked at the display and saw an unknown number, local. I answered, my heart beating in a cadence that didn't match my controlled voice. "Mrs. Thornton?" The voice on the other side was formal but distressed. "This is from the emergency service. We need to confirm some information. Your husband, Pastor Michael Thornton, was referred to the emergency room a little while ago." Everything inside me froze and burned at the same time. One part wanted to laugh, a nervous, inappropriate laugh. Another wanted to vomit. I rested my hand on the counter, my fingernail sliding on the granite. "What happened?" I asked, swallowing hard. Unusual situation has been reported. He is conscious but in significant pain. We need to know if there is a history of heart disease, use of specific medications. We are on our way to St. Augustine Hospital." The attendant's voice seemed to echo between the walls of the kitchen. I saw my reflection in the microwave glass. A 39-year-old woman, hair tied up in a hurry, eyes that had forgotten how to blink. The universe apparently had accepted my push and now returned the movement, faster than I had foreseen. "I'm going," I replied. "I'll meet you there." I hung up. The silence before was now an emptiness that strangled. I felt my throat close and a pair of thick, difficult tears threatened to break the dam. For a moment, I wished it was all just a test, a parable that could be undone with an apology. But no, there was the materiality of a choice. I put on a coat, grabbed the keys, and before stepping out of the kitchen, I looked at the fruit bowl, at the place where, hours ago, the morning seemed small and predictable. It was too late to undo. The car started with a deep roar. I left. The way to the hospital was a corridor of thoughts without guardrails. I wondered what version of the facts awaited me there. What would I tell the doctors? What would I tell myself? The music on the radio was playing a worship song that, in other times, would make me close my eyes and feel my chest open. Today, the lyrics sounded like a cracked mirror reflecting a face I no longer recognized. Was I the same woman? Or had another been born there, in the interval between the first lie I heard and the first I told? When I stopped at the emergency room ramp, I saw the ambulances like white whales, motionless, sighing the lives of others through their metallic nostrils. A nurse was pushing a stretcher, a woman was crying on the phone, and the whole world seemed to be an emergency room. I pushed the revolving door. The smell of antiseptic struck my memory. I've been there before, on visits, prayers next to beds, holding hands with strangers while Michael did his pastoral work. Today, I was just the wife, a title that weighed and protected at the same time. The receptionist asked for the patient's name. I said it. She typed, looked at the screen, then at me, and her expression oscillated between professionalism and curiosity. Triage room 2. He arrived a few minutes ago. With restrained steps, I crossed the overly lit corridor, where the pain of each one shone under cold lamps. I stopped in front of the door with the number 2. I breathed. The doorknob was cold. My hand cold too. I opened it, and I saw my husband, the man of perfect words, pale, bewildered, the pastor's mask peeling off his face like wet paint. He saw me too, and for a second, our entire history fit in the space between our eyes. Sermons, dinners, whispers, promises, and what I had chosen to do that morning. There was no going back. There was only moving forward. Grace, he began, his voice tight, brittle. I took a step forward, the floor beneath my feet like the edge of an abyss. I'm here, I replied. And in that here was everything. Guilt, anger, love already spent, questionable justice, and the certainty that, from this medical event forward, our marriage would enter territory where the map of faith offered no ready-made paths. The white walls of the triage room reflected an uncomfortable, almost cruel brightness. The air smelled of alcohol and latex, and the monitors emitted beeps that seemed to accompany my own heart rate. Michael was lying down, his tie hastily removed, his dress shirt still buttoned halfway, sweat marking the fabric. His eyes, always so controlled in front of the church, now betrayed pain and embarrassment. "What happened?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He looked at me, then quickly looked away, as if shame were a wall. Before he could answer, the doctor entered, wearing a green coat and a serious expression. He held a clipboard and spoke in a tone that mixed technicality and urgency. "Mrs. Thornton, we need to know what medications your husband usually takes. He arrived with priapism, a prolonged and painful erection, probably drug-induced." The word landed like a hammer blow in the space. Erection. Spoken aloud in front of me, the doctor, Michael. I felt a pang in my stomach, part irony, part disbelief. "He takes medication for high blood pressure," I replied with trained naturalness. "I don't know if it could be related." The doctor made some notes, murmured that they would run tests, and asked a nurse to draw blood. Michael closed his eyes as if he could disappear. I stood still, my hands crossed in front of my body, playing the role of the loyal wife who doesn't understand anything that's happening. But inside, the truth burned. I knew exactly what was happening. As the procedures began, I closed my eyes for a moment and remembered the scene from that morning. The coffee, the cup clinking on the saucer, his hand taking the pills without question. He trusted that routine so much that he would never suspect. And ironically, that overconfidence had dragged him there, lying on a gurney at the mercy of doctors who repeated, in technical voices, the most embarrassing condition a man like him could face. What if they find out? I thought. If someone at the hospital recognized the famous pastor of the city, it would be a matter of hours before the rumor reached the church. The image of the man who preached fidelity and purity would crumble in public, and I, consequently, would be dragged along with him. The nurse left to get materials, and we were alone. Michael turned his face towards me, his mouth trembling. "Grace, this is unbelievable." He tried to laugh, but the laugh died in pain. "I don't know what happened. I could have asked, who were you with? What were you doing away from the church?" But I didn't. I just said, "It's going to be okay." The words came out neutral, almost cold. He looked at me, trying to decipher whether there was comfort or accusation in them, but I offered no answer. Time in the hospital dragged on. Each minute seemed to push me towards a dangerous border between justice and cruelty. I wanted to laugh at the irony, The man who preached about resisting temptation was now there, defeated by a blue pill. But at the same time, the sight of him suffering made me burn inside. Was this what I wanted? To watch his body beg for relief while his soul still carried secrets. The doctor returned, bringing news. We will need intervention if the condition doesn't regress. It's been more than 3 hours. This can cause permanent damage. Permanent damage. The word echoed. I took a deep breath, keeping my face impassive. Maybe it was an exaggeration, maybe it was true. But just hearing that possibility made a pang of guilt shoot through my chest. Revenge, sweet at first, now showed a metallic taste. While the doctors organized themselves, one detail did not escape me. Michael was holding his cell phone tightly, as if it were his lifeline. I saw when he, in the midst of agony, typed something quickly and then deleted it. Who was on the other end? Who was waiting for him at that pastoral meeting? At that moment, I understood that my trap had not only hit him, but could expose the secret that I carried silently to everyone. If the news leaked, if someone found out, there would be no pastor, church, marriage, or reputation that could withstand it. And I, in the middle of that hospital corridor, had to face an uncomfortable truth. Maybe I had lost control of what I started. The clock on the wall seemed to mock me. The hands dragged in slow circles, as if wanting to prolong my torture. The hospital corridor was a symphony of hurried footsteps, technical murmurs, and the metallic sound of gurneys sliding across the waxed floor. I was there, motionless, with the feeling that the world around me was spinning, but my life had stopped inside that triage room. It was then that the cell phone vibrated in my bag. I picked it up quickly, fearing it was some message from the church. Maybe someone had already heard rumors. But no, it was an unknown number. I answered with hesitation. Mrs. Thornton? The voice was of a paramedic, probably the same one who had called before. We are confirming. Are you the wife of Pastor Michael? Yes. My voice came out firm, although my throat was dry. I need to inform you that when we found him, he was not alone. A woman accompanied him to the ambulance. However, she fled before providing any information. My heart gave a painful jump. The pieces fit together cruelly. The so-called pastoral meeting, the message typed in haste, his look full of secrets. There was no more doubt. It wasn't just suspicion. It was confirmation. I understand, I replied, cold as ice. I hung up without giving a chance for more details. The world at that moment seemed to narrow until it became a fine line, and I walked on it, trying not to fall. Revenge had been planted with calculation, but now it blossomed in directions that I did not control. I opened the door to the triage room and found Michael gasping, his eyes closed, his body arched in pain. The doctor was adjusting the medication, and a nurse was filling out forms. Upon seeing me, he tried to smile, but his face contracted. "Grace, stay with me," he asked, almost in a whisper. I approached, touched his cold hand. On the outside, I looked like the dedicated wife. On the inside, I was a whirlwind. I saw not only the fallen pastor, but the man who preached fidelity while meeting secretly with another. A groan from him interrupted my thoughts. The doctor spoke seriously. "We need to act fast. The time is already too long. Is he going to be okay?" I asked, playing my part. "If we can reverse it, yes. But there is a risk of complications." Michael turned his face towards me, his eyes watery. "Pray for me." The request pierced me. I could have closed my eyes, held his hand, and said a prayer, as I had so many times alongside faithful members in the church. But inside me, faith was tinged with sarcasm. A man who lied about fidelity asking for intercession at the moment when his own body betrayed him. I held his hand firmly and replied only, "I'm here." But my mind echoed in silence. And the woman who ran away, Michael? Was she there for prayer too? As the doctors prepared for the intervention, a certainty settled within me. That night would mark not only his body, but also the beginning of the end of the farce we sustained. And for the first time, it wasn't his pain that held me. It was the taste of bitter irony that told me that there was no turning back. The walls seemed to close in around me. I was sitting in an uncomfortable chair next to Michael's gurney, observing every detail of the environment, the beeping of the monitors, the discarded syringe in the basket, the air conditioning blowing too cold. Everything there had an aseptic, too clean air, but at the same time impregnated with despair. Michael writhed, and I could see sweat dripping in thick drops down his temple. His lips moved in silent prayers. Maybe he was asking God for help. Maybe he was just begging for relief from the pain. For the first time in years, I saw the pastor strip off his character and show only the man. Fragile, desperate, mortal. A doctor rushed in. "We need to collect more information," he said, looking directly at me. "Is there a history of heart problems in the family? Any pre-existing conditions? Any use of stimulants?" The word stimulants burned my ears. I knew. I myself had switched the pills. But I couldn't confess. "Not there, not like that." "Not that I know of," I replied, forcing a serenity that tore me apart inside. The doctor noted it, gave quick instructions to a nurse, and left. Michael groaned louder. "Grace, what's happening to me?" He stared at me, watery blue eyes, as if I had all the answers. I could have said, "You are reaping the betrayal." I could have shouted, "It's the price of your hypocrisy." But I remained silent. I just held his hand. Inside, every fiber of my conscience screamed, "You did this. You pulled this trigger." The image of the hospital dissolved in my mind, and I was dragged back 15 years before. I remember the day of our wedding. The church was packed, the choir was singing, the white flowers decorated every pew. Michael, in an impeccable suit, smiled with that safe, confident air, as if he had already been born ready to lead a crowd. I believed in every word he said. I believed that he was different from other men. During the ceremony, he looked me in the eyes and said, "I promise to be faithful, to keep my heart only for you until death do us part." The congregation applauded, and I cried. Today, remembering that phrase scratched me inside like broken glass. The same man who spoke those words was now lying down, groaning, hiding messages on his cell phone. A nurse came in and whispered to me, almost as if she were sharing gossip. He wasn't alone when he arrived. A woman was with him, but she fled before giving information. My spine tingled. I already knew, but hearing it from another mouth made it official. It was the confirmation that was missing. I looked at Michael. He closed his eyes, perhaps to escape the judgment that he might find in my gaze. And at that moment, I felt two emotions fighting within me. The bitter satisfaction of seeing his mask crumble, and the overwhelming guilt of having been the one to push him into this physical abyss. Later, I was called for a private conversation with the medical team. We entered a small room, lit by fluorescent lamps. "Mrs. Thornton, we need to be transparent," began the doctor, crossing his hands on the table. "If your husband ingested any type of stimulant, we need to know. The treatment depends on it." My heart raced. My tongue wanted to confess, but my brain held it back with iron shackles. "He doesn't—" I swallowed hard. "Never took anything like that." The doctor sighed. "I understand. Then we will only consider the medications for continuous use. But I need you to know, if the condition persists, there may be a risk of permanent impotence." Permanent impotence. The words echoed like thunder. I left the room trembling. I had created a trap to embarrass him, not to destroy him. But now the line between embarrassment and tragedy was becoming too thin. I went back to the room. Michael was with his eyes closed, murmuring prayers. "Lord, have mercy. Don't abandon me now." I sat next to him. Part of me wanted to confess, shout the truth, ask for forgiveness. But another part, darker, more wounded, wanted him to feel the weight of every lie he made me swallow over the years. What if he becomes impotent? I thought. Would it be poetic irony or too cruel a punishment? I didn't know. The dilemma gnawed at me. I was an accomplice to his suffering, but also his victim. I had planned the revenge, but he had provoked the pain with his betrayal. I went back in memory to the day I found the first message on his cell phone. "Pastor, can I talk to you about a private matter?" I remember the feeling of ice running through my veins. I remember confronting him and hearing his soft, trained voice saying, "It's just counseling, Grace. You're misinterpreting it." He always had a ready answer, always a justification. Until I stopped believing. Now, in the hospital, it was as if every lie came to the surface at once, suffocating him and me too. Time seemed not to pass. With each visit from a doctor, with each exam, with each adjustment of medication, I saw myself in a macabre theater. Everyone believed that I was just the worried wife. Little did they know that I carried the secret that could change the whole course of that night. Michael moaned, sometimes calling for God, sometimes for me. "Grace, don't leave me. I didn't leave him." But I didn't save him either. I remained there, a prisoner of my own silence. I felt a tear roll down my face. I don't know if it was of regret or of anger. Maybe both. I wanted him to feel the shame of the exposed betrayal, but I didn't want to carry him to total ruin. Life is ironic. The man who preached fidelity was about to be defeated by the most physical consequence of his infidelity. And I, who sought only poetic justice, was now faced with the possibility of destroying not only his image, but also the rest of our life. Hours passed. Doctors came and went, adjusting procedures. I remained there, motionless, fighting against my own demons. With each minute, the tension grew. I knew that at any moment, I could be forced to choose, reveal the truth and risk his reputation, or continue lying and watch my husband's body be punished for something he didn't understand. The clock read almost midnight when I finally heard the doctor say, "We are going to start an intervention." I held Michael's hand. He looked at me with pleading eyes. "Pray for me, Grace." I only whispered, "May God do justice." But inside me, I knew. Justice had already begun that morning when I switched the pills. Okay, here's the English translation of the provided text, adjusted for a US audience and YouTube context. The clock had already struck midnight when the medical team returned. The lead doctor, Dr. Harris, adjusted his glasses on his nose and spoke with a serious tone. "We can't wait any longer. If there's no natural regression, we'll need to intervene manually." The words hung in the air like invisible blades. I didn't understand the details, but I understood the gravity. Michael's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. "Manually?" he repeated, his voice almost failing. The doctor confirmed with a nod. "It's uncomfortable, but necessary to prevent permanent complications." Michael closed his eyes, as if wanting to escape reality. I stayed by his side, my heart pounding in my chest. I had caused this. I had meddled with his fate with my own hands. But before they could start the procedure, a nurse came in carrying a clipboard. She approached me and spoke in a low voice, but one that Michael could clearly hear. "Mrs. Thornton, we need to confirm a detail. When your husband was admitted, he was accompanied by a woman. She seemed nervous but didn't want to identify herself. As soon as the ambulance arrived, she disappeared." My whole body froze. I already knew, but hearing it out loud was like receiving a sentence. Michael opened his eyes, stunned, and tried to protest. "No, that's not true," but his voice failed. I stared at him. For the first time, he had no argument, no ready-made excuse, no sermon to justify it. The mask fell. "Who was she, Michael?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, but feeling the fury and pain burning inside. He stammered, trying to defend himself. "It was just a sheep from the church. She was going through a difficult time." The cliché? The excuse I had heard so many times. But now, with the weight of the circumstance, it sounded pathetic, almost childish. "A sheep?" I repeated coldly. "What sheep runs from an ambulance like a mistress caught in the act?" He looked away. He had no answer. The doctor interrupted, impatient. "We need to continue, ma'am. Personal conversations can wait." I let them proceed. Michael was prepared for the intervention, and I stayed in the room as a silent spectator to the cruelest spectacle of my life. The man everyone revered as a spiritual guide was now writhing, exposed, vulnerable, unable to control even his own body. While the team worked, my thoughts flew to the congregation, families who saw him as an example, young people who called him spiritual father, wives who envied my blessed life. And there was the truth, a man naked before his own lie. I almost felt sorry. Almost. I remembered the nights when he said he needed to visit church families. It's my responsibility, Grace. They need me. I stayed home alone, preparing sermons on his computer, arranging his schedule, taking care of the church details. In the beginning, I believed it. I thought I was part of the ministry, that we were together in God's work. But little by little, I noticed the signs, different perfumes on his clothes, deleted messages, unexplained delays. He said, "It was the enemy trying to distract me." I said, "Amen." But inside, I knew that the enemy was not an abstract force. It was his flesh, the desire hidden under the tie and the pulpit. The intervention ended. Michael was exhausted, pale, but finally free from pain. The doctors left, recommending rest and additional tests. I was left alone with him. The silence in the room weighed more than any word. He tried to speak, but I raised my hand, cutting him off. "Don't you dare give me another sermon." He closed his eyes, defeated. "Grace." "I messed up." The phrase came out trembling. "But you don't understand the pressure. The expectation. Everyone expects me to be perfect. Sometimes I fall. Pressure, expectation. Words he always used to justify his own failures. I took a deep breath, controlling the urge to scream. The difference, Michael, is that I didn't preach perfection. I didn't stand on pulpits to talk about holiness while cheating in the dark. "You didn't fall. You chose." He didn't answer. The shame plastered on his face was enough. At that moment, I realized I had two choices. Expose everything, reveal it to the church, destroy his image, ruin our social life, or keep the secret and let him carry the weight of hypocrisy alone. The power was in my hands. I, the silent wife, now had control of the narrative. Michael looked at me, his eyes watering. "Are you going to destroy me?" I stood up, adjusted my coat on my shoulders, and replied calmly, "I don't need to. You've already destroyed yourself." I left the room, leaving him immersed in silence. As I walked down the hospital corridor, I felt a mixture of emotions: revenge, relief, guilt. I had gotten what I wanted: confirmation of the betrayal, exposure of the hypocrisy. But at the same time, I felt the weight of the lie I myself carried. He would never know that it was I who switched the pills. And maybe it was better that way. For everyone else, that night would just be a medical problem. For him, it would be a trauma he would never forget. For me, it would be the reminder that sometimes justice doesn't need to be public. It just needs to be secret, intimate, devastating. Part 6. Translation. The early morning had given way to a timid sunrise. The curtains of the semi-private room let out slivers of golden light, illuminating Michael's haggard face. He looked older, lying there with deep, dark circles under his eyes, his hair disheveled, and his expression filled with fear. When he opened his eyes and saw me sitting in the armchair next to him, he sighed. "You stayed," he said, surprised, as if he expected me to have abandoned him during the night. "Not for you," I replied coldly, "but because I didn't want the doctors to be left without someone to answer questions." He looked away, humiliated. The eloquent pastor, capable of commanding crowds with his voice, was now just a small man, reduced to his own fragility. "Grace," he murmured. "You know that if this gets out, it's over." The word echoed in the air. Over. Over was the pastoral career, the packed church, the televised sermons, the invitations to conferences. Over was the pedestal of holiness. Over was the farce. I looked at him with an almost cruel calm. "Over for whom, Michael? For you? Or for the image you created?" He didn't answer. He just closed his eyes as if wanting to disappear. Throughout the day, doctors and nurses came and went, asking questions, taking notes, adjusting medications. Every time one of them looked at Michael, I saw in their eyes a mixture of curiosity and judgment. It didn't matter if they knew who he was. The scene spoke for itself. His body had betrayed him, and there was no pastoral mask capable of hiding it. I felt like I was in a silent courtroom. The hospital was the court, the doctors were the judges, and I was the only witness who knew the complete truth. The prosecution and the defense were inside me, fighting every minute. As I watched Michael sleeping under the effect of sedatives, I remembered so many situations in which he used faith as armor to justify absences. The enemy is furious with me, Grace. That's why I'm gone so long counseling. It's spiritual warfare. I believed it. I wanted to believe it. It was easier to believe that he was fighting demons than to admit that he was fighting his own flesh. He had the gift of transforming his failures into narratives of spiritual battle, and I was the submissive audience that said amen. Now, in the hospital, there was no spiritual battle, just a prolonged erection caused by a blue pill. Cruel, simple, inescapable. In the early afternoon, he woke up more lucid. He looked at me, his voice weak but filled with anguish. Grace, tell me the truth. What are you going to do? About what? I asked, pretending not to understand. About this. About us. He gestured, his eyes desperate. You can destroy me, I sighed. I got up from the armchair and walked to the window. The sun was shining outside, indifferent to the tragedy that was unfolding between those walls. I don't need to destroy you, Michael. You did it yourself. He tried to get up, but his body didn't respond. He fell back onto the pillow, defeated. If the church finds out, it will be the end of Pastor Thornton, I completed. But maybe it will be the beginning of the man Michael. Who knows, maybe you'll finally learn to be true, he cried. Not tears of faith, like in the emotional sermons, but tears of fear. I had never seen him so naked, so stripped of the armor of pastor. While he was crying, a battle was happening inside me. I could reveal it. I could say, Michael, I was the one who switched your pills. I was the one who caused this. But if I said it, everything would change. He could hate me, he could expose me, he could turn the congregation against me. Or worse, he could victimize himself even more, transforming himself into a martyr before the faithful. If I kept quiet, only he would carry the shame, believing that he had been betrayed by his own body. If I spoke, the responsibility would be divided. I took a deep breath and chose once again silence. In the late afternoon, 2 people from the church appeared at the hospital, Lucy, the assistant, and the elder Harold. They came with flowers, prayers, and curious glances. Pastor, we heard it was just a scare, said Harold, smiling, trying to sound reassuring. God is faithful. He will restore your health. Michael smiled weakly, but couldn't hold his gaze. I received them with hospitality, hiding the turmoil that was corroding me from within. They prayed, laid hands, talked about faith. They left without suspecting anything. But I knew, if the truth escaped, no future sermon would erase the shame. At night, I was alone with him again. The room was plunged into silence, interrupted only by the regular beep of the machine. I watched him sleep, his breathing heavy, and thought about how life can change in a few hours. In the morning, he was the admired pastor, the irreproachable leader. At night, he was a broken man, on the verge of losing everything. And I was the guardian of a secret that could destroy him completely. I leaned my forehead against the cold window and whispered to myself, maybe the real punishment is to let him live with that fear, without ever knowing the truth. 2 days later, Michael's room seemed less like a recovery room and more like a cell for reflection. He was sitting in bed, propped up on pillows, reading the Bible with trembling hands. The scene for any visitor could be edifying, a pastor strengthening himself in the Word after a medical scare. But I knew that each page turned was just another attempt to find justification, another disguise to avoid facing what had really happened. Dr. Harris entered, with the same pragmatic posture as always. Pastor Thornton, your condition has stabilized. You need rest, regular checkups, and follow-up. But for now, you can go home. Michael thanked him, forcing a smile. I realized he was already preparing to transform the tragedy into a testimony. It was what he did best. It was an attack from the enemy, he said softly when the doctor left. He tried to shame me, but God delivered me. I looked at him, incredulous, still transforming the error into spiritual warfare. It wasn't the enemy, Michael. My voice came out firm. It was you yourself. He looked away, uncomfortable. In the car, silence accompanied us like a third passenger. Michael was holding his cell phone, probably anxious to tell the church that he was okay. I was driving, focused on the road, but inside I was reflecting on the weight of my decision: reveal or remain silent. If I told him that I switched the pills, he would hate me. Maybe he would kick me out of the house. Maybe he would expose me. But if I kept the secret, he would live distrustful, wondering if his own body would betray him again. And that doubt, silent and corrosive, was perhaps the greatest revenge. We arrived home. He went upstairs slowly like a tired old man. I stayed in the kitchen, looking at the fruit bowl. The same place where it all started. The same stage of my choice. The following Sunday, the church was packed. Everyone wanted to see the pastor after the scare. Michael went up to the pulpit slower than usual, but with the same theatrical grandeur. "Brothers, the enemy tried to stop me. But God raised me up," he announced, and the congregation applauded on their feet. He told his version: a medical crisis, a divine deliverance. Nothing about the woman who fled. Nothing about the shame of the ambulance. Nothing about the truth. I, sitting in the front row, smiled as always. But inside me burned the certainty. That was not the complete story. The real story was kept in the hospital, in the silence of our exchanges of glances, and in the secret that I carried alone. That night at home, Michael tried to get closer. He put his hand over mine, his eyes apologetic. "Grace, I'm going to change. I promise." This scare was a warning from God. I stared at him, silent. He didn't know that the warning hadn't come from heaven, but from my own hand. "I hope you keep it, Michael," I replied. "Because if not, next time maybe it won't just be a scare." He paled, not understanding if I was talking about health or something else. I smiled slightly. It was better that way, to leave him in doubt. In the early morning, lying next to him, I stared at the ceiling. I could confess. I could free myself from guilt. But I realized that the real strength was not in revealing, but in keeping. Silence was my weapon. He would never fully trust his own body again. He would never take a pill without remembering that night. He would never look at me without wondering, does she know? And I knew. I would always know. Time passed, and for the church, everything returned to normal. Michael continued preaching, smiling, staging his perfection. But at home, something changed. His confidence in me was intact, but his confidence in himself had been destroyed. Every time he was away, I saw in his eyes the shadow of fear. Every time he took a medicine, he hesitated for a second. Every time he went up to the pulpit, he remembered that his holiness did not withstand a night in a hospital. For everyone, that was just a medical problem. For him, it was an unforgettable trauma. For me, it was the sweet revenge of knowing that the traitor would never trust even his own body again. Dear listeners, this was the story of a pastor, a wounded wife, and a silent revenge. Maybe you wonder, how far does the weight of a secret go? How far can the pain of betrayal take us? If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. Every day, we bring you intense plots filled with emotion, dilemmas, and hidden truths. Leave a comment. What would you do in Grace's place? Would you reveal the secret or keep it hidden? Your opinion matters, and it might even inspire the next story.